I'm Mrinalini Vasudevan, Assistant Editor at Marg, joining you from Calcutta. I'm very happy to introduce today's session, which is on ways of seeing, means of knowing. Unfortunately, we have no way of seeing Sundar, but hopefully we will gain a lot from hearing him. This evening's conversation is part of a series of talks that we are organizing, which is on the broader theme of futures of the planet and art worlds to come. We've so far had two very successful sessions on this topic. The first session was with Ravi Agarwal and Heather Davis, and they discussed the idea of the Anthropocene and the crisis in man's relation with the environment. That discussion was followed up by a session with Rohit Goel and Padmini Chettur, and they looked at the idea of incompleteness and a disconnect from nature, which kind of haunts the human body from the moment of birth, and how language and movement can later help us bridge that to a certain extent. Of course, both conversations were against the backdrop of the current pandemic and looking at how we are struggling to come to terms with a changed world. Whether we like it or not, I think we have to keep on engaging with that. And of course, it's throwing up larger questions about adaptability. So that's where we come down to this larger idea of art and science, the interface between these disciplines, and how they allow us to push the boundaries of human experience and perception. And traditionally, art and science are, of course, seen as two separate disciplines. They are taught differently, but actually they have a lot in common. And there is an element of logic, but there's also a kind of creativity and a randomness that is there. And they help us find solutions, not just for problems in the immediate context, but also, give us ways of thinking about the future and planning ahead. And increasingly, we will have to adopt a more interdisciplinary approach to our ways of thinking, which means looking at hybrid models, looking at nature and culture together instead of in isolation. And not just thinking, say, of data, medicine, and digital tools, but also then how they come together with writing, painting, music, dance. How can one aid the other? And of course, how these models then change the way in which we educate ourselves, we communicate, and basically add to our idea of knowledge and reality, how we are judging it, how we are accessing it, etc. This subject has been around for a while. And of course, Sundar and Roger, who've been dealing with it for a few years now, will be able to give us great insights. Roger is a physicist and an astronomer. His area of specialization is ultraviolet astronomy, optics, and space instrumentation. He is professor of art and technology at the University of Texas, and he's also the executive editor of Leonardo Publications, which is brought out by MIT Press. His main focus is on the connection between natural sciences, art, design, and humanities. And he's just told me today that he's also now part of a group called Post-Pandemic Provocators. So they are even thinking of things like how can quantum mechanics be brought together with social change. So lots of exciting things there. Sundar is he's been professor of philosophy at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, and he was the founding director of the Manipal Institute of Philosophy and Humanities. He has written and lectured widely on the subject of the philosophy of science, and he's currently associated with a platform called Barefoot Philosophers, where the idea is to popularize the discipline of philosophy among the general public through talks. Sundar is also on the editorial advisory board of Leonardo Publications and Marg. And both Sundar and Roger will be contributing to our September magazine, so we are looking forward to that as well. Today, they'll be answering questions posed by Rizio Yohannan, who is CEO and publisher for the Marg Foundation. Before we get started on the session today, just a few guidelines to ensure that the webinar experience is smooth. So you won't be able to see all speakers at the same time in the same panel. Whoever's speaking then, you'll be able to see them on screen. And if for some reason the connectivity and video quality is poor, then I suggest you mute the video and just listen in on the session. In general, keep the audio muted because that way you can hear all speakers clearly. Then on the screen, you're going to find a side panel with a bunch of tabs. Please look at the Q&A tab to pose any questions. After the initial 40-45 minutes, we'll have a 15 to 20 minute Q&A round. And I'll be going through all the questions you've put together, and I'll be making a selection for the speakers to address. When you are putting down a question, ensure that it's brief and direct. And it would help if you can mention who it's addressed to. So Roger or Sundar or whoever. And we'll try and take as many questions as possible. But because of limited time, of course, we may not be able to address everything. Please don't be disappointed. What we'd suggest is that we're going to be putting up an audio recording of this entire session on our YouTube page. So you can go and pose your questions there, and we'll definitely get Sundar and Roger to look into those and respond there. And besides these, at the end of the conversation, we'll also have 2 poll questions running. One which is subject specific, and the other which is a kind of general question on the webinar experience. The poll is totally anonymous, and please respond to both questions. It would really help your feedback. Now passing the screen on to Rizio, and then Roger and Sundar.
Thank you, Mrinalini, and welcome, friends. As Mrinalini mentioned, we encountered a technical glitch the other day. But today, that actually strikes me as an insightful entry to this conversation. Because there is such a practical problem arising while we are talking on the one hand about the advancements of science, and on the other, when we have a growing sense of helplessness and anxiety in the face of this new realizations about this universe brought in by new sciences like microbiology, nanoscience, and other fields. So it looks like science has understood human limitations better than ever at this time. And for some of us workers in the world of art, this understanding tells us that the term which we are all familiar with, intellectual humility, is attaining many layers of significance, even as technology is taking us to sites that we would not even have imagined some time back. So in the last Marg Salon conversation, which Mrinalini mentioned on art of incompletion, we were discussing human language as an attempt to bridge this gap. It's a gap at birth between human bodily functions and instinct on the one hand, and our mind's responses to them. So let us take the example of how and what we see and how we respond to a certain vision, say work of visual art or a game that we watch. Scientific research tells us that the visual cortex located at the back of our head, which processes the information coming from our eyes, it is lagged by many milliseconds. This means that if we depend solely on the obsolete data that is there, we will be less coordinated in terms of our responses. So to avoid that, our brain does a fantastic thing. Our brain predicts the path of motion before it happens. So our brain is telling us a story about where something is headed, or any object in motion. Where is it headed? So what we are doing is, this story is becoming our reality. So there is a whole world of visual analysis and computation and prediction outside of our visual system happening in the, say, frontal lobes of our brain. And this prediction is what we perceive as real. And we talk about as real. We always talk about this is real and this is the truth and all that. So now this is what happens with our unique kind of human language. It's got this interpretive capacity we have. We create many interpretations of this perceived reality. And our multiple interpretations tend to create cultural and ideological opposites, different types of conflicts. So in the last salon on the art of incompletion, we discussed the possibility of a fluid, dance-like consciousness, allowing us to go beyond categorical thinking and taxonomies. And we were exploring how the arts can bring that insight to our midst. It looks like the latest advancements in science must help humanity see that it is actually ridiculous to hurt others, human or otherwise, in the name of any one truth. So there is a different level of social responsibility that science is inspiring in us at this time. So I'm hoping that Roger will talk about this during the conversation and the possibilities that that this opens up. So at this point, we realize that the resolution of these conflicts, it is not in homogenizing things, but in creating a fluidity of exchange. It is here that we see today's science converging with philosophy and art. At this moment, science seems to be in a joint mission with art and philosophy. To make us see that a democracy of truths can prevail. These lucid interactions must make taxonomies redundant. And the multiplicity that we talk about is the core value that will sustain life on this planet. And if you want to really go beyond the Anthropocene, this seems a provocation, as to use Roger's term, and a direction. So we are starting this conversation here with Roger, who is a pioneering thinker, as Mrinalini said, in ArtScience, where this convergence is being made apparent today. Roger, thank you for joining us today. We can't really see Sundar, but hopefully we overcome this whole thing with the power of our voices. So now, as I said, researchers have proved that our faculties, sensory faculties, are limited. They lag. We are not really seeing what is real. Our brain is creating a kind of story and handing it over to us as reality. And there is this old question in art: how do we understand art as it tries to represent this perceived reality? So we don't want a conclusive answer to that question, as the exploration of this and the insights that bring are important. So I'm moving on to add a layer to it and ask you this question. Tell us how art science is trying to negotiate this gap between reality and human perception. What is the work happening in this field today? Over to you.
Okay, this is Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So yes, reality lags. My voice takes a little bit of time to reach you. So the me you are experiences is in a different now. So yes, I'm an astronomer by original training. I worked building telescopes that went into space to observe the sky. Why? Well, it turns out that the Earth's atmosphere blocks almost all the information that comes from the universe. So not only does reality lag in our perception, but it is very partial. Ultraviolet light that I studied for many years does not reach the Earth's surface. A lot of it is blocked, as you know, by the ozone layer, but some of the light never gets to Earth. So we're not aware of it, but we are mostly blind. The other thing in astronomy that I realized, and astronomers have realized, is, as you said, we use our visual cortex a lot. Why? Most of the universe does not emit any light. Most of the universe does not shine. Even radio telescopes, X-ray telescopes, infrared telescopes cannot see 95% of what is outside in the universe. Boy. So how do we overcome the way our brain filters the information that is coming into it? And yes, we have to make decisions quickly. If you step out of your house and it's raining, you cover your head very quickly. So we have to think quickly for certain things, and that means we rely on our biases to think quickly. We can't see viruses, and so we can't even react to viruses. We have to think about viruses. The human being is so biased that we think the things we do see are all that's out there. No. And so I think the realization is to make sense, to make meaning of the things that are coming into our brain, we need different ways of knowing. If you go to your refrigerator and you see a tomato that's growing mold on it, you don't think, you just throw it away. It's going to taste bad and it might hurt you. Well, some mold is very desirable. And our body's microbiome depends on all these organisms to make the human body survive. Yes, it's instinct, but for certain things you have to think slowly. There are many ways of thinking slowly. The theoretical astronomer takes all the data. It makes no sense. They try to come up with mathematics that fits the data. If it fits 10% of the data, that's good enough. The rest, we don't understand. What does an artist do? They get excited about something. They want to express that excitement. They know they're excited. And so they create music. They create artwork that somehow captures the experience that excited them so that other people can share it. That's called knowledge. Artists have knowledge. They create experiences for other human beings. I know a few people create music for their dogs and their pets, but most human art is to create experiences for other human beings that help make sense of the world. So I know this is a little bit theoretical and philosophical, but how might it change your daily living? To say, I need to know in different ways. There is no one way of knowing that captures, as you were saying, this lag between how we make sense and what's going on. So I could go on for a long time, but there are some mysterious things that seem to work very well. In astronomy, we use mathematics. Mathematics seems to work. I can use mathematics to predict certain things. And so we tend to study things that happen all the time because they repeat. If something happens every million years, nobody studies it. If you want to do a PhD, you do not study things that happen once every million years. You study things that happen often. If human beings live for 1 million years, we would be very interested in things that happen once every million years. What do you mean? We're ignoring most of the things that happen because they don't happen in our lifetime? Then you get into the Anthropocene. And we didn't notice, actually we noticed in the 19th century that pollution created heat in the atmosphere. It took 120 years for that news to reach the head of the presidents of this planet. And even our American president doesn't think climate change is happening. So I don't want to get political, but politics is a way of knowing. How do artists and scientists work with politicians to live minute by minute when viruses might kill us every day? So every system has biases. Biases are a good idea. If you need to react quickly, it's called instinct. You rely on your biases to live for the next 10 minutes. But if you want to live for 10 years, you better think slowly. So I think I'm going to stop there and turn over to Sundar. I have a lot of other notes to share. Biases are a good idea. Art is a bias, science is a bias, engineering is a bias, politics is a bias, economics is a bias. A bias is sometimes the story that we put together to make sense of something. Most of us are not aware of our own biases. You have to think slowly to understand your biases. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Roger, for this. This is a very important and very intriguing thing that you're telling us now about biases. And I think it's a good place to go to Sundar, especially because Sundar is in a tech-challenged world, which is a good place to think about the fallacy of identifying seeing with knowing, and acting on biases, etc. And it has also been philosophy's major concern for ages, this fallacy of identifying seeing with knowing. Sundar, thank you for joining us. I'm sorry about this, your video not being here. I was telling everybody that Sundar's fans cannot see him, but your voice will make up for that. So in your practice, you engage with the philosophy of science at a time when science has come up with these new revelations about human limitations. And we are experiencing it intensely during this COVID-19 era. And in our first conversation in the series, I also mentioned Yuval Noah Harari's warning that the infotech age, in this age, the greatest challenge for the ordinary human is to struggle against irrelevance. So in an age where microbiology and nanotechnology are trying to illumine the blind spots in the ambiguous human material, what is philosophy's new big challenge? Because Roger said politics is a new way of knowing. So when we are talking about different ways of knowing, what is philosophy's new big challenge? As the everyday human is confronting helplessness on the one hand and irrelevance on the other. Over to you, Sundar.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rizio, and thanks, Roger, for your initial comments. I'm really sorry about this, video problem. I have no clue why it comes in and why it goes out. But just to make sure that I'm really there, I don't know if I've come on the video now.
Yeah,
Rizio?
we can see you.
Okay, so
Yes.
Yeah, it happens this way. Maybe a couple of minutes it will vanish. But this just to, because this is actually points out a very important point about. When Rizio was saying you can only hear me and not see me, I was thinking I'm like the coronavirus, in the sense that you don't see me, but all of us are living as if this coronavirus is all around us. And other than, very creative scientists like Roger and his colleagues, nobody has seen a coronavirus. This video might go off any time, so I'll keep it on for a little bit time at least. This is a very important question, right, about seeing and knowing. And it goes back to a very basic philosophical preoccupation that seeing is not enough. It does not guarantee knowing. And I think in a fundamental sense, what brings art, science, and philosophy together conceptually is the way to move from the seeing to a way to statements of knowing. So just because I see a tree, I can't say I know things about that tree. Even to recognize it as a tree is to find a particular way of moving from my visual perception to saying something about that object which I see. So that's always been a part of it. And Roger's the time lag. And this is something we learn in school. The sun we see now is one which was 8 minutes back. So the moment I see the sun, I say, oh, this is how the sun looks. You're only talking about a sun which was 8 minutes back. So maybe, in the next 5 minutes, the sun might go kaput. You'll only know about it after 5 minutes. So the point is that gap between seeing and knowing, which arises in various ways due to our perceptual capacities, due to our cognitive capacity, due to our linguistic capacities, is really the task of how philosophy tries to make sense of this relationship. And where does it connect to science? The reason it connects at a very fundamental reason to science is because the idea of seeing in science is very different from the idea of seeing in the world. In science, I have always characterized science as, forget about all these other things about science. To me, conceptually, the most important point about science is it teaches us how to see, not what to see. Since we take seeing for granted, the child, when it's born, it opens its eyes, it can see things around it. But scientific seeing is to be able to teach you how to see something, not just what is being presented in front of you. And this raises, this is so important to science because the major objects which we are talking about today, particularly in the question of Rizio, including microbiology, nanotechnology, etc., are things which are too small to be seen. And there is no possibility of direct perception of any of these things we talk about, including this coronavirus. So what gives us the confidence that we are actually seeing things which are completely outside our boundaries of our physical vision? So right from the beginning, we have had this development. The development of science is not just about the content of what it says about the world. It is about telling us how to interpret instrumental seeing. It's saying a lot about the very nature of seeing. It tells you how, when I see through an instrument, I can accept that what I see is really shows me that an object which is really there. So for people who are interested in history of science, if you look at the first stories of how the microscope was accepted by people, it's quite remarkable because you suddenly build a machine and you say, oh, look through a microscope, you can see these small squiggly things. Why should somebody who sees through that microscope believe that you're actually seeing these squiggly things? And that says something very important about trying to convince people to say, look, you're really seeing something which is there. It is not an artifact of the microscope. It's not an artifact of the lens or the system. I'm not asking you for a ride. And a lot of the questions about scientific method, so-called objectivity of science, are just about trying to convince us we are not being taken for a ride about this very rich and complex and funny story about the universe that we are being told by the scientists every day. So this has always been there right from the microscope and the telescope. What is different? And I think by looking at this difference, I want to try and answer the particular question which Rizio was asking about how we see philosophy developing in this kind of engagement with the Anthropocene. Now, I would say in the early parts of your microscope and telescope, the early moments of instrumental perception, ordinary seeing, direct perception, seeing with my eyes was a very important counterpoint. When I looked through the microscope, I was also largely judging what I was doing with these kinds of instrumental perception by comparing it with my direct perception, my physical, sight through my eyes. So there was a long history of people trying to convince others that microbes are like this, or the atoms are really like this. The famous Indian phrase, they are, yeah, they are like this only. So that idea, which meant that the comparison of instrumental perception was always being done with regular perception. But now, what I would call as in the surplus of machine vision, the vision of the machines, in which we are deeply immersed in the surplus of this, that comparative mode where my ordinary perception is the model for my recognizing the qualities of perception, that principle has finally gone. And what you have today is that, for example, one way to say this is that the coronavirus, for all of us today, or for many of us, or most of us, has become like the banana, which I see in front of me on my table. And when I see a banana, I don't have, oh, is there really a banana there? Should I, does it look like the way it looks? I don't have deep questions about whether I'm really seeing that object, whether it looks like that, etc. And today, after being in the surplus of this machine vision, being shown this wonderful picture of the corona with colors and multi lights flashing around it, all of us accept the corona like a banana on my table. And it raises an interesting question. Why would you believe that? I mean, do any of us really think the corona has all these kinds of purple and red color, which they are showing on the TV all the time? How is our engagement with our own notions of accepting what we take for granted as vision? The kind of vision that we have today is an immersive world of vision. In other words, the flip which is happening is that rather than comparing machine vision with the regular direct perception, today our direct perception is being compared to our immersion in the machine vision. And that's why for many of us, the vision of our ordinary eyes cannot match the richness of the machine vision. When I look at the colors on this, all these computers on the screen, the color
Sundar, we are losing you.
Leaf was as green as it is on my computer screen. Our capacity to understand and therefore our motility, our response to the world, our action in the world, which is very deeply influenced by this vision, has also therefore becoming very different. Now, what I would say therefore is that, oh, you're losing me? Okay, I'll cut off my thing. Yeah. So, just a couple of more minutes. Can you hear me now, Rizio?
Yes.
You hear me?
Yeah. Good. Now, hello.
Oops.
No, now it's good.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you, Sundar. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I'll just conclude very soon. So there is another important point which we need to take into account, and this is something which I want to push at because Roger also pointed out to the very special quality of art and its relationship to experience when he pointed about what artists are trying to do. Now, I think there is one way in which we can characterize this, which is that I do agree that the green leaf which appears on my computer screen looks lovely and so on, great colors. But when I experience a green leaf which is outside my window, I ask the question, how does that green leaf appear to me? How do I experience that green leaf which I am seeing on a tree? There are many very fundamental differences in the experiences of the real direct perception and what I see through the computer screen. I'll just tell you one and stop here as far as this example goes, that the leaf appears as part of the world. Everything I see in my direct perception appears as part of the world. And one way in which we understand it is you see the leaf because the light is reflected by it. And you need an engagement of the world and the leaf in order for it to come to your presence. Whereas very interestingly in this digital world of instrumental perception, the light comes from the object. The light comes from the screen. In great full darkness, I can still see that beautiful green leaf as compared to the green leaf outside my window. And this has, I think, the immersion of all of us into the screen world, the visual screen world has great impact on not just, for philosophy, but also through its engagement with reality. I'll just say 3 basic sentences and stop here in terms of new philosophies and new challenges. One, I think new challenges for philosophy is that we need to find the vocabulary and language to interpret this surplus immersive vision. And we have gone way beyond even the early discussions on virtual reality, augmented reality, and so on. The second very important point, in my view, is that we have moved away from the question of logic, of moving from what I see to what I know, which is a logical process for science, for example. We have moved from logic to rhetoric. I'm not interested in convincing you, arguing with you, showing you how what I see leads to what I know. I'm interested rather in performance. It's a kind of a rhetoric in which we are all caught in, and we just say what we want about what we see. We do things with what we see, and our engagement with what we see has completely changed this particular shift back from logic to the rhetoric. So it is persuasion all the time about the world we see, this artificial world of vision that we are offered in the digital world. And I would also say another way in which this becomes very important for philosophy is that the question of experience, it will come back into prominence, where experience will replace questions of knowing. And because this kind of visual world is an experiential world in a very fundamental sense, it comes back to what Roger said about art. Now we see this experiential immersive world as very much part of the science. And the last point I want to say on this about the new philosophy is that it raises questions about what it is to do philosophy. Is philosophy just about scholasticism, taking some old books and trying to read what people have been saying? Or rather, are we going to now look at philosophy as life practice, as practices dealing with how we lead our lives, including the most important practice of how we learn to see the world? I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sundar, for this. What you've thrown open is a lot of things which we can take like a seminar to really discuss. So I'm quite excited about all that you're saying. Like one thing that I would like to take off from where you stopped and go to Roger with this question that you're raising about the surplus immersive vision and the kind of prominence given to rhetoric at this time. And also the knowing is a kind of undermined and experience come to the forefront of things, etc. So everything points to a place where there is a given impression that the human being is more and more undermined. The human beings, there is an incompletion, there is an imperfection about things because there is a kind of perfect, more vivid kind of thing which this instrumental perception is offering us. So, I'll take that question to Roger from here. Roger, given this context, I would like to know your thoughts on the tools created by science to take us closer to reality. That is one part of the question. But in the ArtScience project that you're doing now, which Leonardo referred to, nano provocations, that you're currently engaged in, artists create nano replicas of artistic and architectural works using technology. My question is, aren't the technologies constructed and mediated by the lagging human senses and the assumptive human mind also prone to the pitfalls of these limitations? They might be faster, scalable, more vivid than our direct senses, but can they belong are they belonging to another dimension? Can they help us shift the paradigm that we are in right now and lead us to a post-Anthropocene world? What is your take on this? Over to you.
Okay, so Unfortunately, Sundar has given me some ideas, which is why we interact. So I will try and answer partially your question, but I want to react first to Sundar's unpacking of how our mind lags what is actually going on outside us, and how screen-based knowledge now is becoming such an important factor in knowing things. And as he said, the leaf outside my room here, I see because light is reflected off it. And anyway, it's the scientists have figured out why the leaf looks green to human beings, but it doesn't look green to cows. But what I guess I want to add, Sundar, to the argument is, right now we've been talking about how an individual knows something. And I think one of the other things that's going on is collective knowledge. And I think that's beginning to mean something different than it used to mean. So it is slightly mind-boggling, but we're in Calcutta, Bombay, Bangalore, Dallas. The five of us know something at the moment that nobody else on this planet knows, and all the people listening. And I think we're getting into an era where, because of the rapid feedback loops due to screen-based knowledge, collective intelligence is becoming, well, it's maybe collective stupidity. So let's be careful, because we're now talking about in Dallas about how people are not wearing masks. I won't want to get into that discussion. But the idea that the feedback loops of screen-based knowledge are so rapid that collective knowledge, collective intelligence, collective consciousness, and that's a difficult question that scientists struggle with. What does awareness mean? Is AI aware? Yes. If you're using AI virtual assistants, well, your knowledge is now coupled to the knowledge of the artificial intelligence. So, yes, there's individual knowledge and there's knowledge of a group of people. A beehive as a hive knows things that the individual bees don't know or don't think they know. And we have this myth of the queen bee who organizes all the knowledge. So let me just leave that idea that the screen-based knowledge has been changing the way we behave, but also that because of the feedback loops and so on, collective knowledge is becoming different than it used to be 1,000 years ago. Obviously, groups have always, and that very quickly gets into politics, which is a form of collective knowledge. This is the way we do things in Texas. This is the way we do things in Bangalore. So let me just end with then this idea of post-pandemic provocations. I live in a country which is very racist. What is the smallest object that has color? And as Sundar said, we see pictures of viruses with all these artificial colors. Viruses don't have color. That's an artist's imagination of assigning colors to viruses. Are viruses racist? What is the smallest thing that exhibits racial behaviors? Let me just leave that question there. And that gets into quantum mechanics very quickly. Thank you.
Rizio, I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. I was saying this is a good moment to go to you, Sundar, because Roger was talking about the distinction between individual knowledge and collective knowledge, which is also gathered over a period of time. So we know about myth making, and which as a kind of way of building collective knowledge, you know. So, and Roger also said that in the last 1,000 years, the way in which you build collective knowledge has drastically changed. So, I want to take this question of collective knowledge, myth making, etc., and human imagination. And I'm coming to you with this question of about human imagination. Beyond seeing and inferring knowledge through what has been seen, human beings also possess this, one could say, transcendental faculty of imagination, which can project new experiences. You know, we have the capacity to think in abstractions and also visualize hitherto unseen worlds and our language aids us in this, because our language helps us create these worlds. So how do you see our imagination? Because you talked about our senses and their direct apprehension of things or perception of things vis-a-vis instrumental perception. So how do you see our imagination vis-a-vis our senses? And is imagination just a feature of our brain story-making function, which we just talked about? And also, what do you think is the most critical function of human imagination in these times? Because as Roger said, we are seeing all these different colors of the viruses, and I've seen actually WhatsApp videos where people are interviewing villagers who really say that the viruses are this big, and you can actually see them coming out of somebody's mouth and all that. They really believe it, you know. So what is this critical function of human imagination at this time? Because we also talked about, on the one hand, helplessness of the ordinary human being and the irrelevance that the ordinary human being feels at this time. How do you look at this?
Okay. Thank you, Rizio. That's a very interesting and a very large question, because one of the themes which philosophy has engaged so deeply with is the idea of imagination. But what I'm going to do is to continue with what your questions and what Roger has been saying by looking at one aspect of art science. So I want to look at the relation between imagination and art science, since that's sort of our focus today. And we could begin by asking the question, is imagination something which is universal, which is common to the practice of art and common to the practice of science? Or are there different types of imaginations which are present, and so on? So let me, for the sake of time, let me give you one common element and one very different element, which will speak to what Roger was also saying. The common thing between the imaginations of art and imagination of science is that the idea of imagination as some form of inner seeing within ourselves, not seeing with our physical eyes. So this inner seeing, knowing that we live in a hegemony of vision, that all of our intellectual products, whether it's from philosophy or science, comes from vision, being aware of that, if you want, you can call imagination as inner perception. But I'm just using seeing as a short term for that, okay? So you could call imagination inner perception. The types of inner perceptions in art and science could be very similar. In fact, we know it's very similar as far as the creative process is concerned. Very interesting work on creativity in science, art, music, literature, business, and so on, which have been done by various psychology groups around the world, have shown, for example, the flow model, which is very famous, the 5-step model, which is very common to all these kinds of activities. So definitely a kind of this inner perception, inner eureka moment, recognitions of these things are indeed quite similar. At least we have empirical evidence to say that. But as I said earlier, the real question is, how do you go from seeing to knowing? What is my path from seeing something and saying something knowledgeable about it? Now, in the case of the imagination, the same question can be phrased as follows. It is, how do you go from your inner sight or inner perception to outside knowledge, to outside knowing? And that comes very close to what Roger was talking about. The very important fact of scientific knowledge is that it is a collective piece of knowledge. The collectivization, taking an individual insight and collectivizing it, legitimizing it for a larger community, is an extremely important aspect of what constitutes this very act of seeing to knowing. Now, this is exactly where the difference also occurs from art science. For science, the move from inner perception to outside knowing is absolutely a must. That is how science is created. So if Einstein had the inner thought that E equal to mc squared, the demands of science is that he produce it in such a way that it becomes part of collective knowledge. So the path is from that inner to the outer, from sight to language and so on. So it's a very fascinating, I mean, we can get immersed in this for hours. But for the artist, what does the artist do with the inner imagination? What are the expectations and pressures on an artist to engage with this inner moment, inner experience? So sometimes it could be just presenting that experience, presenting it as an expression, for example, which is one of the theories of art, or not even saying anything about it in the context of knowing. The resistance which is there in art to reducing inner experience, inner perception to states of knowledge makes it very different from the practice of science, where the inner perception has to be commodified into a kind of an outside knowledge. Now, so while this is very clear, I mean, this is a part of the way in which we can make sense of the function of imagination in art science. But if I want to extend this to today and ask in these times, what is this critical function? What is it going to be? Now, there is this question about the transcendental also, which you raised. The idea of the transcendental is actually, I would say, very common to science and to arts in very different ways, or like as it is to religion. And just to give you a very quick example without entering into it at all, is that the very idea of mathematics, which Roger spoke about more than once earlier, is as a transcendental entity is an extremely important influence in the growth of science. And you don't even have to go look at very complex mathematics. You look at the idea of numbers, and you look at numbers like 0 and infinity, for example. All these ideas related to these mathematical entities have been seen always in a transcendental sense. In fact, they have led to so many different kinds of philosophical questions about the nature of mathematics. But what is interesting here, we should remember, is that for the Greek and the European tradition, mathematics was very closely related to the practice of theology. Connection between understanding the divine and looking at mathematical objects, which interestingly doesn't happen in Indian traditions at all, even though some of the most important progress in mathematics much before it came to Europe had actually happened in India in various other cases. So these are very cultural ways of understanding mathematics, but it also has this question of transcendence always present in this. So what then would be a very critical function of this human imagination? One is to go back to an idea which is very common between what a tradition we would call as phenomenology, which is a study of consciousness and experience and so on. I want to use it in a very broad sense here. And there, the idea, which is also very much part of our everyday lives, it's not that we have to do philosophy to have this idea, which is just this, which is that imagination is a specific capacity. And what kind of a capacity is it? It is a capacity to make absence present and present absent. And that's a really remarkable function of human imagination. That is, when I am sitting in the absence of elephants in the room, I can still imagine elephants in the room. I'm able to make the absence of those, which is what a lot of fiction is, and therefore its connection to literature, you can see how closely it's related. And at the same time, it is not just making absence present, it also makes present absence in the way in which we imagine the in front of me. I can sit here and imagine this computer I'm staring at as something entirely different. The chairs and tables I see as something very different. And these are very important common imaginative capacities in art, science, and many other things, including various other kinds of practices. Now, what I'm suggesting is that this idea will undergo a change now. Now, if it has already undergone change, and in the years to follow, this fundamental, simple principle of human perception and human imagination will undergo a change. In what sense? What has happened to us in our technological world today is that, and especially in the COVID-19 era, where all of our meetings are in this Zoom and Zoho and whatever else it is, that we live in a world of perpetual world of absence. That is, I have been living all these months, staring at the screen, meeting people over the screen, giving all my talks to students on the screen, and I haven't met anybody. I don't even know. I think I know how they look, but I may not recognize them when they come in front of me because they're going to look very different from what they look on the screen. And this is not, the COVID-19 is just exacerbating this whole larger practices which have become part of our daily lives. We know that children spend much more time immersed in this media than looking out at the world or doing things in the world. Then we live in a perpetual world of absence, and our digital world is a constant engagement of absence. Then we have to recover new ways of understanding presence. What is it to be present before me? We need to find new ways of understanding it, because the idea of presence has always been a very difficult question, very important for theater and the arts, particularly more than any other domain. And we have to now figure out, what is it to make myself present in this world of absence? What is it to make you as other human beings and other material things present in my life? That is going to be, I think, one of the, this recovery of the present from the ocean of absence is going to be one of the critical challenges. And the second challenge, and the most critical feature of this imagination is something which maybe some others may not be as sympathetic to it as I am. But for me, in this coming out of this technological imagination, one of the most important recoveries that we have to do, the recovery of the present, is nothing but the recovery of the human. And the human, what I mean by the recovery of the human is the recovery of the human as a social being. This is, to me, one of the most important, probably the more urgent task of imagination today is, how do we imagine the social in this world today? What is our imagination of the social? And here I think both art and science have been complicit in their very dismissive engagement with the idea of the social. For a variety of reasons, art has often been associated with individual genius, creativity, individual ways of looking at the world, interpreting the world, and so on. And science has been too concerned with presenting itself as objective truths, independent of human interests, that both of them have forgotten the most fundamental character of a human being is our capacity to live in harmony as social beings, to live in harmony with difference. And that imagination has to be given. It has to be created within us. And how is that imagination going to arise in this COVID world? How is this imagination of the social, of knowing what it is compassionately with others? How is that ever going to come in a world of perpetual absence as in our immersion with these technologies? I think that's a challenge. I'm not saying it as a critique of the technology or of art and so on. I'm just saying it's a great challenge for us, is to be able to negotiate these kinds of technologies and the fast developments within science and very many innovative work which is going in art and at the intersection of art science, to really rethink the imagination of the social. And can science do this? I think science can do it partly in the imagination of progress and development, which has also been a problem at some level. And can art do it? I tend to believe more in the capacity of art to be able to show us something about the human in far more important ways, and not just as artists, as protesters and so on, in terms of the conceptual foundation of art itself. But I still think there is an enormous amount of work which we need to do, enormous amount of education which we need to do in order to recover the sociality of humans as compassionate beings able to live with one another in this amazingly rich, complex world of absence where we are all so alienated from each other. I'll stop here.
That's fantastic, Sundar. So actually, this I was actually planning to stop here, but then because you're saying this, I would like to come back to both of you with a quick question also, because what you're saying now connects us with the next conversation in the series featuring artist Riaz Tebji. Riaz has been engaging with Gandhi's architectures and his understanding of the human body as a common and as a space-making faculty, the behavior of which can change the character of space itself. So when you say there is an urgent need to, the challenge of human imagination is actually to recover presence in this world of absences, and also more importantly, to recover human sociality. I think this figure of Gandhi and what Riaz is going to kind of engage with in the next conversation in the series is very important. So I would, so in that we will be exploring the question of human body, architecture, and space making, because so it connects to this responsibility of human imagination and this function of human imagination that you're talking about. So because of that, I just want to prelude, I want to prelude to that conversation, and I'm coming back to both of you quickly about I would like to bring this discussion to the question of aesthetics, which we didn't really talk about, but a particular aspect of aesthetics. While we are talking about, again, coming back to the question of human body and how to see human body as a common, etc., etc. So is there, this can be answered from both the art.
Sorry, we lost you.
Okay, am I there?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm saying, I just want to bring this to the principle, the question of aesthetics, because of these connections with the next conversation. So it will act as a prelude to that. Is there any principle of beauty? It's a very controversial term, but I didn't mean it in that sense. But is there any principle of beauty that marks nature as a common within our culture that sees itself as constructing new realities, or it's a world of absences also, and in this world of absences you are constructing new realities with technology? Is there how do you see the principle of beauty and nature as a common? Both of you, this is to both of you quickly, like 2-3 minutes, if you can respond to this.
Sundar, if you'll let me just jump in. So I'm glad you've put this topic of the imagination on the discussion. One of the people who influenced people in the West, especially astronomers, was Jules Verne, and he made a very simple statement: we can only invent what we can imagine. So maybe we have a problem today of a failure of imagination. How do we improve our imagination? How do we redesign our imagination? I was part of a group in England on cognitive innovation. And there, one of the most exciting areas of art and science today is coupling the neurosciences and our understanding of how the inner mechanisms of the brain work. There is so much going on in our brain that we're unaware of. And how do we train our imagination? Now, that's part of what education should be, if Jules Verne is right. You can only invent what you can imagine. But we have a problem. We are human beings. And that biases our imagination in frightening ways, which gets me to the topic of beauty. 40 years ago, I got married to my wife, Christine, and our honeymoon trip was to India. And we visited Bangalore and Calcutta and New Delhi, and we went to the Taj Mahal. It's beautiful. And then we get back to mathematics. So I'm going to dispute Sundar's claim that mathematics is a Western invention that connects theology with mathematics as a theological structure. Why is the Taj Mahal so symmetric? Why do we think that's beautiful? There's a very well-known artist called Stelarc. He built himself a prosthetic third arm, which he could activate using his shoulder muscles, and he taught himself to write with 3 hands. He could write with his left hand, his right hand, and his artificial hand. And he said, you know, I can no longer say on the one hand this, on the other hand that, because my middle hand said, hold on a second, I'm just as important as the left and the right. So symmetry is a human bias because we are bilaterally symmetric animals. If we were not symmetric animals, I promise you the Taj Mahal would not be symmetric. I can't prove that, but that's my claim, that our physical body limits our imagination. Symmetry is good, and physicists love symmetry, supersymmetry, blah, 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 blah. But then there was another famous, and I apologize, another man. Yes, Western science is dominated by men. That's an implicit bias of science. Another man, his name was Albert Einstein. And I'll finish with his quote. Our ideas are just as independent from the shape of our bodies as our clothes are. Why don't we have 3 shoes? What a stupid question. We only have 2 feet. Where would you put the 3rd shoe? The shape of our ideas is as independent of the shape of our body as our clothes are. And the fact that we are symmetric means we like symmetric things more than asymmetric things. I hate to tell you, almost nothing in the natural world is symmetric. Yeah, you can find patterns that you emphasize that make it look symmetric, but that bush with the leaves outside is not symmetric. And what makes it interesting is the lack of symmetry. The natural world is not controlled by the biases of the human body. I'll stop there.
Sundar, you would like to take...
Yeah, very well. This is not self-promotion, but I've written a book called Philosophy of Symmetry. So the moment I hear symmetry, it's like, you know, I want to jump up from it. Yeah, it's called Philosophy of Symmetry and looks at ideas of symmetry in science and art and so on. But anyway, I mean, there is, as Roger was saying, there's so many interesting things. Why symmetry functions as a foundational principle in art and science and so on. But just to respond to your point about beauty, is that we know, and this is something which Leonardo and Roger also know very well in their own columns on art, aesthetics and science, by people like Ruth Bernstein and others. There has been a lot of work on aesthetics within science, and to me, one of the best examples of it comes from the mathematician G.H. Hardy. There has been a lot, aesthetic principles in experimental methods, in theoretical structures have all been very deeply influential. There have been very important experimental claims made on the basis that the theories which were beautiful were supposed to be right. The most famous example from sociology of science is the proof of Einstein's theory of relativity by Eddington. And when sociologists look at all this material in which they had discovered of Eddington's, and it does not prove conclusively that Einstein's is right, the famous eclipse experiment which he had did. And when asked, and he came back, they asked him about it, he was such a famous scientist, he could get away with many things. It seems he said, the theory is so beautiful that it has to be true. So he was basically saying, don't bother me about nitpicking about experimental stuff. Dirac, one of the founders of quantum theory, is also very famous for having said this. G.H. Hardy, G.H. Hardy, one of the great mathematicians who is known very much in India because of its quote-unquote discovery of Ramanujam, Srinivas Ramanujam, has this to say about pure, beauty in maths. For him, the very idea of beauty in maths defines to him the value of that mathematics. And beauty is lost the moment it becomes functional, the moment it gets used somewhere else, like the application in the sciences. So this is, I think there has had some traction within the sciences, but not in the way in which they have asked about the question of what is beauty. Like, let's say, for example, of philosophy, etc. I will not, obviously enter into any of that. I just make a very quick comment about why this question of beauty is very relevant to us today in a political sense, not just in an aesthetic sense. Because when we are talking about this question of absence and presence, one way in which I could phrase is this: how do we understand the beauty of absence, of things which are absent? Because remember, historically, across cultures, we tend to associate beauty as a positive quality of a positive thing, an entity which is present in front of me. Absence is a very funny entity. And when we talk about beauty of absence, it raises very many interesting questions. And I'm saying this because not just to confuse the whole issue at all, but because beauty was seen as positive in terms of certain kinds of qualities is what leads to the idea of racism. That's the point. Because darkness and black is absence. It is not a positive quality. It's not a color. There's a wonderful discussion on whether black itself is a color, etc., or just absence of color. How do you discover the aesthetics of black? When you know that you recognize it as a negative entity or as a kind of an absence. So this has, I know the question of aesthetics is deeply political. It has many connections to this. But I think in the case of art science, they both have expanded the notions of aesthetic, of course, in very many interesting ways. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sundar and Roger. I would have actually liked to continue this conversation, and I'm sure in the days to come we will do that, because there are a lot of things which both of you have raised, and there are points of convergence, there are points where we need to clarify things, etc. So I hope in the coming issues of Marg also we can in this art science space that we are creating from September onwards, we will be able to do some of these things together. And at this point, I'll hand over to Mrinalini to do the Q&A. Mrinalini, over to you.
Yeah, it's been like a great session, and that's evident from the number of questions that have already come my way. Trying to figure out how many to take. But I think first I'll go with Levin Ahmed, and this is for Sundar. So his question is, what do you think about post-humanist optimism about the blurring of nature-artifice dichotomy?
I think that, yeah, okay. So the nature-artifice dichotomy also has a lot, the strength for it really comes, or the grounding for it really comes from very traditional notions of nature. And a part of the nature, the breakdown of the dichotomy is also the recognition that the very idea of nature is deeply indebted to human social practices and human imagination. So the moment we understand what you call as nature is actually indebted to this kind of a larger sociality, then the question of the nature artifice itself falls in the wayside. And we can see that across in many examples. I think our digital technology is one example where there is a physical representation of the breakdown of the nature artifice divide. So today we have to find other kinds of binaries to capture the work which the nature and the artifice or the artificial was doing in the earlier era. And that has to come from looking at how different cultures have understood nature, how different technological
We're
imaginations have
losing you.
changed. Yeah, I'm saying that because of that, we have to really understand how to reconceptualize the very idea of nature in today's time, because there has been a large amount of change in that repeatedly.
Okay. In fact, as connected to that question is something else that's been asked by Ravindra Ji. So he's asking, would technological developments alter our ways of seeing and knowing in some fundamental evolutionary way and become parallel to natural sensorial ways of seeing and knowing?
So, Rizio, maybe I could jump in.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
please do. In fact, he's kept it open, so it could be Roger or
Yeah,
yes.
Roger can. Yeah.
I think Roger can address that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let me just pick up on the post-human question,
Okay.
but also on Sundar's comment about, and it's such a truism that it's stupid, but words matter. And as he said in English, and I don't know in your various Indian languages, I think you have about at least 60 of them, or maybe 300. Blackness is associated with the absence of color, right? And so racism, by using these words, focuses on the idea of absence. Ironically, in astronomy, most of the universe is black. But we don't call it black, we call it dark.
Yeah.
Dark matter, dark energy.
Yeah.
Well, a dark thing is not the same as a black thing. And I don't have time really to expand on that, but let me connect it to the idea of words matter, post-human. That is so a human-centric way of thinking that it's frightening. And if anything that we've learned is that when you have 7 billion people on this planet, thinking about individuals is maybe a very problematic approach. If there are only 1 million people on this planet, this virus would not be a problem to humans. And viruses are not problems to most things on this planet. So when we start using words like post-human, we're referencing everything in that context. And then just to finish with the other question, yes, I think our technological senses now are slowly creeping up and becoming just as fake as our real senses. So then you get into fake news and fake perceptions. How do I know, Rizio, that you're really nodding at me? I know how to make a virtual human on a Zoom, on a Zoho call that knows how to nod when she's agreeing with me. And now we're imitating each other. Well, very soon, not only do we have artificial senses, most of them screen-based, not all of them, but we are going to soon have artificial creatures that know things we don't know. And we have to talk to the AI to know things we don't know. And in science now, discoveries are being made by AI software, and humans cannot explain how it was found. Is it right? So AI doesn't care about human notions of beauty unless the software engineer put in that bias. the AI has totally different ideas of what makes sense than we do. So let me stop there.
I'm glad you brought up the whole question about fake news and false knowledge, because actually somebody had pointed, there's somebody called Dr. Tapasvi who brought that up, saying that, currently, especially in the Indian media, there's so much talk about like false knowledge, etc. But we are gradually having to come to terms with a world where, yes, we may not be able to, this whole understanding of what is truth, post-truth, etc. We are having to deal with.
But stop. Why do you think human knowledge is true?
Exactly. That's important. Yeah, that's true. It's just something that's been, I think, ingrained in us. That's also there. Okay, Roger, another question, in fact, which has been, again, you can take it or Sundar can also take it. How can artists be agents of knowledge dissemination about scientific understanding beyond science communication and art and science collaborations with practitioners and philosophers? So in another sense, basically, what is the onus of the artist as an agent of art science practices? This is a question to you, and it's from Shashank Satish.
Okay. So, Sundar, excuse me, I'll speak again.
No, I want you to speak on this. Yeah, please answer this. Yeah.
I'm breaking the symmetry of the organization of this discussion.
Yeah.
You and I are supposed to alternate speaking in a symmetrical fashion. What was the question again? Go ahead.
What is the onus of the artist? As an agent of art science practices.
Okay, yes. So that gets into a really simple discussion that different ways of knowing complement each other. They are not in service of each other. Art is not in service of science. Science is not in service of art. We need every possible combination. And so the onus on the artist is not to make science understandable to the general public. The onus on the artist is to reimagine what the scientist is saying and frame it in a totally different way with their imagination. So yes, we need science communication, and artists have wonderful ways of converting data into sound. And let me tell you, you can understand things by listening to data that you can't understand by looking at it. Why? Because music is time-based. Visual arts, not cinema, are visual-based. Dance is both time-based and space-based. So how do you communicate an idea? How do you translate it? And we get into a different discussion here. How do you translate a scientific idea into dance or visual art or music or cooking? Cooking as an art. You create a human experience by combining not colors together, but foods together. So, the way that we think of art and science as ways of knowing, yes, sometimes art should be in the service of science. Yes, sometimes science should be in the service of art. But really, we're talking about complementarity and not combining them into one new way of knowing. Art science is not a new way of knowing. It's a way of combining different ways of knowing.
Thanks, Roger. Sundar, maybe you can take this next question. It's by Isaac Matthew. If art is an individual imaginative construct, is it not quite different from an imagination permutated by science, which is a collective imagination? At which point do the two relate to each other?
Okay, so I think all imagination, in the way we understand the common meaning of imagination, are individual practices, capacities of the human system in the body, the cognitive, physical system, and so on. So imagination itself is located in a sense within the individual. The point is, how does that imagination which is located within you becomes a public entity, something which you might want to call as objective, available to others, presented before others? And what kind of legitimacy will they have when it is presented before? The real difference, as I said, is in the ways in which the presentation is done and what is accepted as accepted within the community as a acceptable presentation. That is, for example, what it means is that you could have an artistic imagination by an artist, which may come out in the form of a painting, which has to be accepted by the arts community as representative of the painting, which is accepted by them as art. Do something which the larger community doesn't accept as art, it is not going to be seen by anybody as art. So, but we have to remember that their acceptance of something as art is a socio-historical process. There is a long history by which certain ideas of art have come, many styles of art have come, and so on. In a very similar way, when science, imagination, ideas, and insights, and sudden eureka moments come, and you want to present it as something which is available to the larger community, there are other kinds of rules which you have to follow. So, for example, the scientific system of writing a paper, getting it peer evaluated, repeating that experiment by others, etc., etc. So, the whole structure of the institutions of science are produced in order to find ways of legitimizing the transfer of individual imagination to collective entity called knowledge. So, I would say that the ways in which we accept what is acceptable for the larger community, of what is acceptable for the collective of that which defines that community is going to be is a central thing. I must also add here just a quick point to this very important emphasis which Roger made about art science, which is also related to this point, and that art not being in service of science, etc. And we know that in the Indian context, it has not always happened. It has not happened at all. So I wouldn't say not always happened. And part of the reason is art and science, the two words, are actually mean many things. One is a kind of a practice, one is a way of knowing the world, etc. But there's another extremely important meaning of it, which is related to the collective imagination, which is art is an institution and science is an institution. Until historically that science got institutionalized, you did not have a discipline called science which becomes globally distributed. So it is while art and science may not in service of each other, and they shouldn't be in that particular sense which Roger was talking about, the hierarchy between the power of the institutions within a society matter to the practice of art science. When scientists are very dominant power, for example, in a country like India, as compared to the artists and the larger art community, it influences the way in which we end up understanding art science in different places of the world.
Okay, I'm going to take the final two questions. So Roger can address this, and then I'll have one last one for Sundar. So Roger, this is for you. It's by Abhishek Chauhan. How does science address the idea of the transcendental as is done in arts?
Okay, so this is Roger. I cannot answer that question in 3 sentences. But please, anybody who would like to interact, please send me an email. If you can't find my email online, it's readily available. You can find it through some of the online platforms, because some of these discussions are really, really fundamental. And let me just preface this by saying I am a devout atheist. I am a devout atheist. That doesn't mean I'm immoral. That doesn't mean I'm unethical. And that it doesn't mean I don't think there are certain things that transcend human experience. So yes, part of the imagination is trying to transcend, get above the small picture that we each have? What is the bigger picture? And we would love the bigger picture to make sense. But I, as an atheist, suspect that the bigger picture is just chaos, disorganization, temporary stable things. I think the transcendent framework is in fact turbulent, chaotic, unpredictable on certain time scales. But this is a very, what is the big picture? And I don't think, as an atheist, that appealing to external intelligences helps us understand the big picture.
Okay. Sundar, final question for you. This is posed by Harshvardhan Siddharthan. There's a long tradition in philosophy wherein art is opposed to truth. Can we speak of truths in art? How can we characterize truth in art, and how would this truth differ from truths in science?
Okay, again, like Roger said, there's a lot to say in this. But yeah, it's an important question. I think the one interesting way of looking at it is to say in all the art science debates. So let me do this pitch, okay? This pitch would be that, like in the very important comments Roger made about the idea of the transcendental, between this relationship between art and science, you can think about philosophy's task. What does philosophy offer to this engagement between art and science? So we are always outside. Philosophy is always outside everything. It is the true definition of transcendental in that sense, and in the context of the transcendental, there's a very important way in which one can also look at it from a philosophical dimension. One is what Roger said, outside human experience. That's a very important definition of transcendental, and that's one meaning of it. But there's another very important meaning of the transcendental, which is not outside human experience, but the grounds of human experience. That which makes human experience possible, but that by itself is not a product of human experience. And this becomes a very important tradition within, the Kant and the various other, a lot of modern philosophy. So I'm using this as a way to enter into this art science debate by even saying, just like the question of the transcendental, so is the question of truth. There are very naive, as correctly the person is saying, that the earlier pictures of suspicion towards art and the fact that it is always false and it is deceiving you, etc., have been present in certain traditions, particularly the Greek tradition to a very dominant extent. But there have been many ideas of truths in art which have been part of other cultural traditions of art. And one of the best examples is we have to get away from, just like vision was a dominant hegemony in all our intellectual efforts, vision is also very dominant within artistic enterprise. And we tend to look at visual art as a very important representative of art when we talk about art. But if you look at performative traditions and performance arts, including dance, theater, music, and so on, the question of truth is central to them. There is no text which describes, for example, in the Indian traditions about music, theater, and dance. Theater, which outwardly is all about fakery because somebody else is acting like somebody else, is the most profound questions concerning it. For example, from the Natya Shastra, texts are all about recovering the truth, if you like, present through these artistic practices. In fact, art there becomes, the purpose of art there is deeply related to the capacity of experiencing truths, of reaching certain levels of truths which are not available through just the intellect. So there is, I think, that idea of truth in art, which, by the way, comes back in different ways in Western thought, particularly with Gadamer and others, when they open up the meaning of truth and looking at it in a larger plural multiplicity. I think it's, to me, in my own understanding of this issue and my engagement with artists, the truth in art is a foundational pillar of the function of art. It's may not be instrumental and convertible into things like technology in that sense, for a large amount of science, but the kind of science which Roger is talking about, the truth about the universe, just recognizing what the universe is all about, is a very different kind of non-utilitarian truth. And I think truth in art, in many senses, is about this kind. So there is an overlap, but there's a lot of truth in science which has become which is very different kind of truth, which is applied in various contexts and so on.
I think with that, we've got to wrap up today's session. As I said, there are many more questions which we'd ideally like to take, but I think it would be best, as Roger said, if you could, you can of course individually contact them, but you can also put it up with the audio recording that we'll have on our YouTube page. So, thanks everybody for what's been like a really great, stimulating session. And we look forward to more interactions. Roger, can't hear you. Oh,
Yeah.
hear you
Just
a bit.
a final comment for everybody that's listening or will listen later to the recording. This is part of a discussion that we're having between Marg and Leonardo of how we might collaborate in the future, bringing together very different perspectives on these questions. And so we look forward to working with Marg in the coming years, decades, and why not centuries, if we can find ways that we can do things that we cannot do alone. Collaboration is not an objective, it is a means. We know that we are unable to understand what's going on. Maybe by working together, we could.
Okay. So ways of doing is what's going to now be the next big thing. But Rizio, do you want to add any further comments? Yeah.
Actually, Roger has said exactly what I wanted to say. So this is Marg and Leonardo will, in the days to come, certainly, we are discussing ways of doing things together at this point, not at the level of, transactions or anything, but at the fundamental level of inquiry. And how do you understand these things? Can we make a change in our thinking? Is there something what is it that we are seeking? So at that level, so we are very happy to have found a partner in Leonardo and Roger. So as Mrinalini earlier mentioned, in the September issue of Marg, which is a new avatar of Marg, we have a conversation between Sundar and Roger. So I hope all the audience, members of the audience here will stay with us on this Marg and subscribe to our publications, and especially the magazine which is to come, the new issue of the magazine. And Roger and Sundar, I'm extremely thankful to both of you. I know that there are limitations of technology, etc., but we shall overcome as we go. So it has been a very, very insightful conversation, but I also see that some of these questions which you have raised are extremely fundamental, and we need to really, as Roger said, spend decades and centuries to really work on them. It is inexhaustible, but it is very thrilling also, for Marg and I'm sure for Leonardo also. So thank you very much for this. And Mrinalini, you want to close?
Yes, thanks everybody. And please, of course, check out our YouTube page for a full audio recording of this session, and of course to add your additional questions. And also like and subscribe to the Marg Instagram page and Facebook page, and visit our website for all information about our publications as well as other activities. We are going to be launching our latest magazine and a Badri Narayan book next week. So there's lots to look forward to. I think we can close now. So yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Roger. Lovely talking to you.
Roger. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay.
Good night.
Thank you, Mrinalini.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good night.